lesson, we're going to be covering the New Deal, which ranged from 1932 to 1940. So an overview of what we're going to be talking about during this lecture are the major pieces of the New Deal. The main focus was public works projects and public support that were meant to counteract the Depression as it continued on, and people were living in poverty and felt like they had no way out. The Democratic Party at this point made a turn towards becoming this coalition of farmers, industrial workers, intellectuals, reformers, Northern African Americans, and weirdly also white supremacists from the South because they wanted protection from big businesses. So the Democratic Party was the one that was willing to put in more of the regulatory aspects that would provide the checks and balances for the government and for big business. Liberalism had meant limited government and the free market, but the modern meaning, which was sort of evolving at this point during the New Deal, was that it was a more active government, and the purpose of the government was to take care of those who needed help, essentially. Some of the major accomplishments of the New Deal are Social Security, the Fair Labor Standards Act. Some of the major misses that you could look at were not fully covering African Americans and most women either. And we'll go over these things in detail throughout the lecture, but this is just an overview of what we're going to be looking at. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the one who was overseeing this entire process. So he was born in 1882. He is a distant cousin to Theodore Roosevelt, who we talked about before. He was the Undersecretary of the Navy during World War I, and he was a vice presidential candidate in 1920. And he never made it to be vice president because they lost. But he was elected as president in 1932 with 57% of the popular vote and actually 88.9% of the Electoral College. We described how the Electoral College works before, so you'll remember that there are different electors within each state, and if they win the state, even without winning the popular vote necessarily, they could still win the election. In 1921, he suffered a case of polio through which he lost the use of his legs. Because there was no TV at the beginning of this, he never really had to be as straightforward as someone would today about his situation, so many people did not even know that he was in a wheelchair. He's remembered quite fondly in American memory, and as time goes on and more information comes out and more groups speak out and we learn more history about different people, we have a more complicated view of his character. Most would probably still put him in the good category, but I leave that up to you when you learn more information about him. One thing that he did do to speak directly to the American people was these radio broadcasts, what he called fireside chats. It was meant to be a more informal addressing to the Union rather than having an official speech that was broadcast through the radio. These were instead a conversation. I've included the first fireside chat video here. You can hear the first one. And that was in 1933, and it was on the banking crisis. And so he continued to do this throughout his presidency. And you can look them all up. They're all available easily online that you could listen to them. So he is responsible for instigating the New Deal. And the New Deal is seen largely as an alternative to socialism on the left because it didn't reach as far as socialism. It was an alternative to Nazism on the right because it didn't have this racial aspect or this national socialism aspect. And it was also an alternative to the inaction of unregulated capitalism. So it's not business as usual, it's not the status quo, but it's neither as radical to the right or the left as democratic socialism or Nazism. The brains behind these policies are FDR himself, Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, who was the first female cabinet secretary, and Secretary of Interior Harold Ickes, as well as Louis Brandeis, who was a Supreme Court of the United States Justice. And the main point was to regulate society and big business rather than starting from scratch with a new system entirely. So they wanted to tweak the system that already existed rather than trying to scrap it and start again. So they weren't going all the way over to socialism. They were attempting to include some socialist policies without moving entirely that way. This was mostly in response to the Depression and the continuation of the severe financial crisis and people's cries for help, essentially. They were attempting to get the economy up and running. Really, the New Deal wouldn't provide all of that. It would wait until World War II to come back. The banking crisis began when the banks across the nation were closing because they didn't have funds to pay out what people were asking to withdraw. So they didn't actually have cash enough for all of the money deposited in their banks. By March of 1933, many states had actually suspended banking entirely. They had decided to close the banks, and they suspended the concept of banking. So if you had money, you had to keep it at your house. If you had money in the bank, you likely weren't going to see it. There was a national bank holiday that was declared when there was a pause on banking across the entire country, and the Emergency Banking Act was put into place that ended up sort of bailing out the banks that couldn't pay. So the government came to the aid of the banks that couldn't pay to try to get money to the people who had deposited within those banks. At this point, the Glass-Steagall Act was also passed, and that barred commercial banks from investing and selling stocks because it was deemed too risky to be in the stock market. This was repealed in the 1990s, and there's a direct relationship here between what the big banks, the too big to fail banks, were doing and the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. So they'd been barred from doing this for a long time, and when the regulations were lifted, they went to investing in the stock market, and eventually lots of things collapsed, as we know, and in the early 2000s, we hit the Great Recession. But we'll get to that later in this summer session. And the FDIC was also created at this point, and this is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And what this does is it covers the accounts of individuals to convince them that it's okay, again, to deposit money in banks after so many failures. So what they would do if a bank went under was give money back to the person. So the government would cover it, essentially. Think of it as a small bailout. The NRA is also part and parcel of this, and we're not talking about that one. We're not talking about guns at this point. The first meaning of NRA was actually the National Recovery Administration. And this was part of the 100 days, which is the first 3 months of FDR's administration, in which many laws and acts were passed. So it was seen as this flurry of legislative activity within the first 100 days of his presidency. The NRA was part of the National Industrial Recovery Act, which established industry codes for output, prices, and working conditions. So it was an attempt at the government level to control what was happening within private business. He put these regulations into place, hoping that they would provide a fair work situation. And in reality, the NRA was really overrun by corporations and molded to their own uses rather than the one that it was established for. And you'll see throughout the New Deal that there are all these different agencies that are created and all these different acts that are passed and all these different acronyms. So we'll see a lot of NRA, FDR even, FDIC. We'll see all these different abbreviations, and I don't expect that you'll remember these unless you, for some reason, need to. But we're going over the major concepts of what these are so that you can understand the sorts of things that happened and this sort of push to keep creating all of these different laws and these different administrative bodies. There were many government jobs that were put into play at this point because people couldn't find work elsewhere. In March of 1933, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, was established, and this put unemployed men to work in the natural landscape of the United States. So some of the projects that they were involved in were forestry-based. They were to create flood control, work in the national parks, and the wildlife reserves. It remained a program until 1942, and about 3 million men had gone through the program, and it was initially an alternative to the war as well. In May of 1933, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration was established, and this provided grants to local agencies to counteract the effects of the Depression. So if people weren't able to buy food or if people weren't able to obtain shelter, this sort of funding was provided for people on the individual level. The Tennessee Valley Authority was also created at this point, and it was given the job of dam building in order to prevent floods and deforestation. And what it actually ended up doing was creating a lot of hydropower, and that provided inexpensive electricity to homes and factories in the area. And it was the first time that the government was involved in the production and sale of electricity. So the utilities had generally been private up until this point. There were many other public works projects that were put into play, and many of them were put on by the Public Works Administration. And they had about $3.3 billion allocated in order to create projects that both employed and benefited the public. So they would hire people who were unemployed, and they would be building things that the different communities would then be able to go on and use. They were oftentimes in charge of building things like roads and schools and hospitals, bridges, public facilities, and that sort of thing. The Civil Works Administration was similar, and it had about 4 million people working on highways and tunnels, courthouses, and airports. There was some dissent from portions of the population that thought that these programs created some sort of public dependency on the government for jobs, and that the cost of the projects were too high because they were government-based. The people who were protesting this eventually helped to get everything shut down. So this is a map that you could go back and check out all the individual pieces if you'd like to. But these are public works projects throughout the country. So you could zoom in and check out all these different pieces if you wanted to. But basically, it's to show you, at minimum, how many things happen and how far, how spread out they were. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA, was established so that the government could set production quotas and pay farmers less to plant less crops, or pay farmers to plant less crops in order to raise the prices on the market that would then kickstart the economy. So meaning they would pay farmers not to plant cotton or not to plant corn in order to artificially raise the prices of them. This process even led to the killing of 6 million pigs in 1933 because they needed to raise prices. And many people saw this as sort of a strange tactic, because their fellow citizens were starving in some cases, and by just killing the pigs and not selling them, certainly some of them were given to people, but it seemed like a waste of resources in a time where resources were quite scarce. This program did not extend to non-property owners, so it actually hurt tenant farmers and sharecroppers who were already at the bottom of the farming pay scale, as we've talked about before. And this sort of payment to not farm only helped those who had enough to have a farm to begin with on a large scale. The Dust Bowl was, you've likely heard of this. In 1930, the weather was so dry and drought took over a lot of the farmland in the West. This is in combination with farming practices that were not conducive to soil health and not conducive to a sustainable practice on the land. So the farming practices that they've been using created this sort of dire situation where there was erosion, and when winds blew, they actually carried soil away from the farms. So you can see in the picture up top, there's all this dirt, this soil blowing through the air. And about 1 million farmers were displaced during this time, and heavily concentrated in the region of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. And there will be on the assignments page a little clip posted for you from PBS about the Dust Bowl, so you can look into that a little bit more. And certainly, I'm sure you're aware that there are lots of things that have been published over the years that talk about the Dust Bowl. In combination with all of this, you have housing restrictions that the New Deal was hoping to change. So there were housing regulation changes on the rise. Outside of the farms and in cities, there was a huge bust in the housing stock. Many people were too poor to afford a house, and the government actually started to think of ways that they could get people to purchase houses. The HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, both things that you're probably aware of existing today, insured mortgages so that people could fight foreclosures. And part of this was also to convince banks to give more people home loans because they would secure that footing between them. So the banks wouldn't necessarily need to believe that the people were going to be able to pay it back as stated, and the people borrowing the money didn't need to be as worried about foreclosures. The Veterans Administration eventually helped out with this, especially after World War II, with the placement of veterans in houses. Part of what they did also was create more low-rent housing for some people by building new places and asking people to pay what they were able. And with these housing regulations, with these loans, and with the insurance, there were limits as to who had access to them. So usually it was white families who had access to this. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. The 21st Amendment was passed and overturned the 18th Amendment, which had led to Prohibition. This happened in 1933. So alcohol came back on the scene, and you can see people on the left here protesting for beer. The Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, which you're aware exists still today, was established at this point to oversee the broadcast airways and phone usage. And the Securities and Exchange Commission was created in order to regulate stock and bond markets to try to avoid what had happened before from happening again. And some of the extra laws that they had passed were what they were going to be overseeing. So the Glass-Steagall Act, for example, they were going to be ensuring that banks had not invested their money in the stock market. And all of these regulations that we've talked about so far are part of what's called the first New Deal. It basically helped in a lot of ways, but still left the issue of sustainable recovery on the table. A lot of this progress was eventually later struck down in courts over the following decades, and especially following the Vietnam War, when there was sort of this turn towards conservatism. As with every decade we're talking about, there was continued labor upheaval. And part of this has to do with the government finally being on the side of the workers. So the workers felt more empowered to make moves. The leaders of the labor movement were oftentimes socialist and sometimes communist, and oftentimes they were second-generation immigrants. So their parents had moved to the United States, and they themselves spoke English fairly well, if not as their only language, because they had grown up here. So they had more ideas from different countries, but they had the ability to work within the American system because it's the one that they had grown up in. In 1934, there were about 2,000 strikes across the nation that included some violent clashes with police. And there was one in particular that included 400,000 textile workers from New England all the way to the Deep South. And they jointly went on strike to fight within the United Textile Workers Union. While overall it was a failure, it was the recognition of rights of the members of the union and workers in general that they came away with. So the businesses couldn't entirely ignore them anymore, and the government wasn't willing to ignore them either. The CIO, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations, was made up of multiple kinds of unions. It's this pan-labor organization. When we say pan anything, we mean all these different groups coming together into one. So by not organizing into specific crafts and specific jobs that they were in charge of, the numbers of the people involved in the strikes grew. So you could think about this as something like the Occupy movement, where people were coming together with all these different complaints, all these different hopes that they were hoping to institute, and they all moved together to make a bigger impression. In 1936, the UAW, or the United Auto Workers Union, enacted sit-down strikes. So what they did was halt the production, but they remained inside the building so that they couldn't send in strike breakers to do the job anyway. So they really did stop up the entire production. And this led to GM and other companies actually having to bargain with the workers themselves. By 1940, there were about 9 million members in the CIO, which was double the number from 1930. So within 10 years, it had doubled the amount of people who joined. part of the platform of the union was that there should be more socialist programs like public housing, universal health care, unemployment, and old age insurance. So a lot of the things that were eventually established through the New Deal. Religion played a part, as it often does, and the fundamentalist push continued. Father Charles Coughlin was one of the more famous radio preachers, and he had millions of listeners on the radio. He criticized everything from Wall Street to the government to the financial crisis, basically anything that people were really upset about at the time, he was also going to be talking about it. Eventually, his message unfortunately shifted into the realm of anti-Semitism and support for European fascism. So the more liberal streak that he was on did not continue. There was this divide between followers of these radio priests because they were using this modern method, the radio, to talk about an older message of fundamentalism. So they were caught somewhere between modern times and attempting to keep tradition alive. There was also a female priest, a revivalist, who had her own show, Amy Semple McPherson, and she was out of Los Angeles, and it was relatively rare for a woman to have that much religious power in a public way at that time. The second New Deal follows the first, and the major differences are that the first New Deal was focused on recovery, and the second was focused on sustainability. So the first one's putting on the Band-Aid, the second one is physical therapy, essentially. There was a push for redistribution of wealth at this point, rather than just buying up businesses. The Congress ended up setting a tax on the wealthy and on corporations. So the money to pay for the programs was coming from somewhere, obviously, and they hit the top of the wealth brackets and companies. There were also conservation efforts and farm assistance that were set up as government-sponsored electricity that we talked about spread to rural areas. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, employed about 3 million people from its start to its end in 1943. What they did was build public buildings, bridges, about 500,000 miles of roads, airports, and within its ranks, it was many, many formerly white-collar workers who had lost their jobs, and the businesses that they had been involved in either didn't exist anymore or they had just been so severely cut back because of the Depression. There were some artistic endeavors that went through the WPA, and those included things like murals on buildings and people to write the local histories, and those who wanted to bring art to those who may not have the ability to travel to the different museums around the world to see the famous works of art. The Wagner Act was put into place, and it outlawed the firing of a person based on their being a member of a union. So this meant that you couldn't be in danger of losing your job if you were a union member, which before, many times companies had fired, if they had to lay people off, they laid off union people because those were the people who would fight against them sometimes. It also disallowed the blacklisting of leaders of unions. So it meant that you couldn't keep telling everybody who was a leader of the union and telling all these different companies not to hire them. We talked about Social Security as being one of the major wins here for the New Deal. And in 1935, there was the passage of the Social Security Act, which provided unemployment insurance, aid to the disabled, aid to the elderly poor, and aid to families with dependent children. This is a permanent social insurance as opposed to the program that had come before it, which was sort of this temporary thing. So this is more in line with the sustainability aspect of things rather than the Band-Aid fix. This turned the United States into what is commonly referred to as a welfare state. And what this means is that there's some sort of system of income assistance, health coverage, and social services for all citizens. It fell short of the European models that covered people in all of those areas and collected more money to pay for the programs. So while the United States did make some relatively large changes, they still fell short of other industrialized nations in these realms. Originally, there was the intent to include national health care, and this comes up over and over again. But the AMA, the American Medical Association, fought this because they didn't like the idea of governmental regulation of income and activities in the medical realm. This system did not cover domestic workers or agricultural workers. And what this meant was that most African Americans were not covered and most women were not covered by this original system because oftentimes African Americans were doing domestic work or agricultural work, and women, if they were employed, were also often doing domestic work. And so far as the political realm here, outside of these creations of new programs, the 1936 election was divisive. The vote went clearly, the Electoral College vote, if you look at this little map over here, went very clearly to FDR, and he won 60% of the popular vote, which is still pretty large. But he was criticized as being this threat to freedom and this potential dictator in the making with all the programs that he wanted and this sort of big government. It was at this point, too, it's just an interesting note that the inaugural address was changed from March 4th to January 20th. This is the 20th Amendment, changes the time when a president becomes active so that there's a shorter lame duck period. The U.S. Housing Act, the next year, helped in building homes for the poor. The Fair Labor Standards Act was instituted a year after that and was instrumental in establishing a middle ground between workers and employers. So it was looking at what was fair, what still allowed companies to make money but protected employees. There were some limits to these changes, as I said before, and women suffered many of the limits of these changes. So although there were more women in government than there ever had been before under the New Deal, organized feminism was actually on the decline, and some of the issues were if women should be involved in the workforce en masse, or if men should be able to have their jobs. Eleanor Roosevelt is one of the more famous female figures from this time frame, and she was married to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She was First Lady of the nation, and she was one of the first to make it a politically charged one. And the Economy Act of 1933 actually stated that both members of a marriage could not hold government jobs. So what this meant was that most of the time it would be women who were dismissed in these cases because men were making more money than women, and they often held higher jobs higher on the hierarchy. But this did include many banks and public schools, which just outright didn't allow women at this point, because if you couldn't have more than one partner in the marriage working for the government, they chose the men in these cases, in most cases. Because most women weren't working, they weren't earning wages, they would be contributing to the Social Security benefits, and therefore wouldn't be able to receive aid. We also have what's called the Indian New Deal, and this is Native Americans ensuring that their situation would also be improved during this time of reform. One thing that they fought for was the end of forced assimilation. So we talked about the boarding school process before, and they wanted an end to that system. They were also interested in establishing their own cultural autonomy while remaining citizens of the United States. So they wanted to be citizens of the United States, but they also wanted to be able to make tribal decisions as they had before. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act put an end to the land division policies that had come before, where they had split up the reservations and parceled it out to individual families. Well, the self-determination piece of this was essentially granted. There was still widespread poverty, and this remains a large issue for the Native American community in the United States today. Mexican Americans also had limits placed upon them during the New Deal. So there were many who were returned to Mexico, both voluntarily and at the strong suggestion of local authorities, meaning they were basically told that they needed to go back. This included about 200,000 children who had been born in the United States. And due to the 14th Amendment, they were actually citizens of the United States, but they had to go to Mexico with their parents who were not. The work that Mexican migrants performed in the United States was largely farming in the West. So when they were deported, there were protests from farmers, and there was a lack of labor available for them to properly take in their crops. There were over 1 million Mexicans deported from the United States during the Depression, and some were victim to aggressive removal campaigns. So I've included a clip on the assignments page for you to watch, and it's really not the most well done video, but it is really great information, and it's first-person accounts of what happened. And part of what's important about first-person accounts is we can take the information that we've learned from other sources and see how things match up and see what might need tweaking, or like how we could understand how somebody would say a particular thing that doesn't appear to be true based on the more objective information that had been gathered. African Americans were also largely left out of the New Deal, as I mentioned before. And if they did have jobs that were covered by Social Security, oftentimes they were fired because most companies favored unemployed white workers over black workers. So in the face of this discriminatory behavior, many people boycotted the firms that had fired them with a "don't buy where you can't work" campaign. And this withholding of money from different companies was actually really effective, and this was a tactic that the African American community used over and over again as a way to break the barriers of segregation. And Eleanor Roosevelt and the cabinet had actually paid special attention to segregation disenfranchisement, meaning blocking of the vote, and lynching at this point. And Eleanor Roosevelt was dedicated to the point where she resigned from the Daughters of American Revolution after they refused to host African-American singer Marian Anderson at Constitution Hall. When she wasn't allowed to sing at Constitution Hall, she gave one of the more iconic and moving concerts at the Lincoln Memorial at Eleanor Roosevelt's request. And it is a really moving performance, and I've included a clip of it here for you to go watch. There was obviously social segregation where people were not allowing different races to enter different areas. So racial segregation was required if there was federal money given to home building or financing. So neighborhoods were required to stay separate at this point and start to move into this concept of redlining. And the colors on maps for realtors represented grades of how good an area was. And the grades corresponded to which races could live in certain areas. So there were limits on who could live where. And integrated neighborhoods could not be established using federal funds. The FHA even included statements that barred future home sales to non-white owners in some cases. So if a white owner bought a house, it could potentially say that they needed to sell to a white person when they wanted to sell their house. Out of the federally employed African Americans, 98% of them were serving as clerks or janitorial staff. And in the South, African Americans were barred from working from the government by and large. And it wasn't until the 1960s, with LBJ's Great Society movement, that most African Americans were covered by these governmental programs that we were talking about. One of the more famous photos from the era will be probably familiar to you. It was taken by Dorothea Lange, and it's the migrant mother. It's the top picture on the right here. And what she did was she was determined to photograph people as they were during this process, and photographing people who had to move from one place to another, and all this movement throughout the country to find jobs and to find farms and to find food. And in the same realm, John Steinbeck famously wrote The Grapes of Wrath, and this depicted the everyday lives of the people. So these were stories and visuals of everyday people rather than what was happening at the political level. And in response to this growing diversity and voices from these diverse groups, there was established the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. And this was established in order to investigate disloyalty stemming from communism or labor radicals or just the left of the political spectrum in general. In 1940, the Smith Act made it illegal to teach, advocate, or encourage the overthrow of the government. So you weren't supposed to talk about it. You certainly weren't supposed to teach about it. And you were essentially suggesting treason should you do so. The South was at odds with the progressive note of the New Deal. Even as FDR noted, and as many historians have noted, the economic situation in the South was quite dire at this point. They were lagging behind the North in industrialization, education, and healthcare, but they still were against these different programs that could help them. The focus on Europe and what was happening abroad led to the end of the intense focus on the New Deal that had occupied much of the 1930s. So as the 1930s grew on and it became more clear that war was going to break out in Europe, the focus went from the New Deal policies over to how to contain Hitler and how to contain the Japanese Empire. There were substantial accomplishments that came to be in this era, like unions being supported, banks being regulated, the stock market having oversight, home ownership was loosened and allowed for more buyers, and there was a social safety net that was created that hadn't been there before, in the hopes that the desperation of the Depression wouldn't return. Physically, there were new dams, there was reforestation, there was rural electrification, and there were numerous public facilities and roads and bridges that had been constructed at this point. Even if things fell short of the ideal and didn't include entire groups of people, there were major advances. So that's one of the things about history, is that it doesn't always include everything that we'd hope that it would include, or that it seems hypocritical to exclude, but we should celebrate when things had moved forward, and this is one of those times. And as I mentioned before, World War II was really the solid end to the Depression that the New Deal couldn't be on its own. So while the New Deal did make many changes and did help the economy, it wasn't able to reverse the effects of the Great Depression. So we'll be moving into talking about World War II for the next lecture.